Welcome, everyone, to the Reader's Digest Book Club. I am Tracey Neithercott, your host, and I am here today with Paige Toon. She is the author of 16 adult novels, a YA series, and a short story collection. And her latest book, Only Love Can Hurt Like This, is her first to be published in the US, and it is our Reader's Digest Book Club pick for May. So, Paige, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I am so excited to talk to you about this book. But before we do, for anyone who hasn't read the book yet, can you just give a quick overview of what the book is about, what people can expect if they want to read it?
Sure. So Only Love Can Hurt Like This is a story of Ren. And when we meet her, she is just going out for her lunch break and she happens to see her fiance with his co-worker and they share this look. And she just senses that there's something going on between them, that they have an emotional connection if they're not already having a physical affair. And so she just trusts her instincts, and sure enough, he's fallen in love with someone else. She basically witnesses the moment that he realizes that he's in love with somebody else. So we pick up with her 3 months later, and she's taking a break because she keeps seeing him and his new girlfriend around their small town. And she goes to stay with her father and her father's second family in Indiana, in America. And while she's there, she doesn't have a very strong relationship with her dad when she goes to stay with him. She's maybe only seen him, for 2 weeks of every year for the last, most of her life. He had an affair with another woman when she was about 5, and this other woman fell pregnant. So she has a young half-sister, Bailey, who she also doesn't know very well. On this first night out, she goes out with her half-sister, and now they're both in their 20s. I think that Ren's actually 31, but Bailey's a little bit closer in age to her. It sort of feels like, they kind of have a bit more in common. And they go out for this one night, and Ren walks home after having had a few drinks through a firefly sort of strewn field with big red barns and cornfields and things, and almost gets run over by a very hot man called Anders. And Anders is the brother of the farmer who lives next door to her father's new fruit farm, and he's home because his brother Jonas is struggling with his mental health and having some difficulties. So Anders and Ren have a connection, but this is a real slow burn romance. There's a reason why he keeps her at arm's length. He has this earth-shattering, impossible sort of secret, so it's a real impossible love story with quite a lot of emotion sort of woven in, but lots of fun moments too throughout.
Oh yeah. I love this book. Honestly, if you haven't read it yet, definitely go pick it up. It was so fun. I love the romance, obviously. But I was surprised to find that probably my favorite part of it was Ren's relationship with her family. Like you said, she is, coming to stay with her father and her step family, who are kind of strangers to her, and she feels like this outsider, and I just love that transformation. You have issues that are a bit heavier than this isn't a light rom-com. There are issues of depression, mental health, some issues related to Anders' secret, which we won't get into right now. But it's a really rich novel, and I loved all of those elements of it. And so I do want to touch on Anders and what he's going through, but I'm going to leave all of that for the very end so that we don't get into spoilers until then. So if you're watching and you haven't read the book, we will tell you when to turn off the video.
Great.
But for now, I just want to start from the beginning. Really, where did that first spark come from for this?
I've been wanting to write a book set on a farm for a few years. I love the idea of that. I had this idea when during the pandemic. I went for these night walks around the fields near where I live, and the family farm, the local sort of family farmers have had their farm handed down from generation to generation for something like 200 years.
Wow.
So I was sort of thinking about just the pressure that you must feel, to take on, it's like a family legacy. The eldest son is just expected to farm, and and what that would feel like. And I also knew that farming, there was a really high rate of depression, and it's one of the worst professions for suicide, for example. So that idea started to form in my mind. But it was actually when I've spent some time living in Indianapolis. I spent some time when I was a young child, so I remember things like the fireflies and how vivid that felt, and the big red barns and cornfields, and and I remember Indianapolis. And then we went back again when I was in my 20s, and a lot of the places that I write about are real places that I used to love going and visiting. That section, when we were there in our 20s, I just heard of this awful thing that had happened. And a few years ago, the same thing happened to a friend of a friend. And I
Wow.
just remember thinking, this all relates to Anders' secret, which obviously we won't give away till the end. I think that's a very good idea. But I heard of this happening again, and I just thought I couldn't imagine a worse hell for the people involved in this situation. So that really stayed with me. And I realized, later that these two stories would work really well together, that I could still write about the farming element. And then when I thought about the setting of America, I love to write about the places that I've lived and worked. I have written about America before in other books. I hadn't written about it for a while, and I just thought this would fit really, really well in that farm setting. I could just picture the cornfields and, like I say, the fireflies and the big red barns, and and then also be able to write about my favorite places in Indianapolis and include that as well. So yeah, a few ideas all kind of came together to form the story.
Yeah. You mentioned that there are farms near you, and for anyone who is not aware, you live in England. Are you living sort of in farm area right now? I'm looking out your window that is very green and
Yeah, we live in the countryside, just outside of Cambridge. It was a small city, beautiful city. Yeah, so I just love going out walking in the fields. It's one of the places where I get my inspiration. So just the fact that I was out there walking, and basically during the pandemic, I went out for this walk on these fields, and I imagined a heroine walking home after having a few drinks and bumping into a hot farmer. That was like where the meet cute kind of comes from.
Now, did you do research for the farming aspects, or did you talk to what sort of research did you do?
I do an insane amount of research for my books, and I mean, hardly any of it ends up going in the book, so you won't be bogged down with the research, but I really, really like to understand. So I did speak to our local farmers, and he helped me with loads of different parts of storylines. I got to go behind the scenes at the farm and look at all the farming equipment and just understand that. I spoke to a person from the Indiana Department of Agriculture. She was talking to me about popcorn farming and different, elements of that. I found another farmer in Indiana, southern Indiana, around the area where I was imagining the book being set. And he had a blog that he wrote in every few days. So I was able to reference the blog and work out exactly when they'd be planting pumpkins, or when they'd be doing, in fact, I don't think they planted pumpkins. That was more research, but, I was, and then I reached out and got in touch with him, and he was so helpful. He was just lovely. I could ask him about any sort of question, and he would fill it in, so I hope it feels very real, because a lot of research goes into behind the scenes when I write my books.
No, it does. It feels like this is a farming, and I think that's a testament to your skill, because it could feel, you don't want it to feel like a textbook. We're reading this for enjoyment, but it does feel as if it's pulled from reality. And very early in the book have that scene with the storm, and it's pretty tense, and there's all this danger. And I imagine that is also something that real farmers have to deal with and consider. And
absolutely. I mean, when we were in Indianapolis, I remember a tornado warning going off, and just like, in fact, the apartment where Anders lives is the apartment where my parents lived when we lived in Indianapolis. So at the real silk lofts, these amazing loft apartments. I reimagined it as looking much cooler than my parents had it. But, it's much more architectural in Anders' world. But that was kind of pretty scary, just hearing a tornado siren going out. But I can't imagine what it would be like to be out in the middle of nowhere. With that happening, you really would feel very vulnerable.
So in terms of research, did you also because you just mentioned, farming has a really high incidence of depression, and that mental health element that you wove in there with Anders' brother and his father, to find out. Is that something that you did a lot of research on as well, just to, see what the issue is in farming in general, or American farming? And what sort of research was that?
That was mostly internet research. Like I just did scour loads and loads of websites to just read about it. I haven't, my notepads, I just fill up like these notepads every time I research, there'd be pages and pages and pages in there about the statistics and depression. So obviously I don't write in those statistics because that's not, what someone wants to read. And I don't remember offhand, but it was an alarmingly high. I mean, it was one of the top 10 professions for suicide, and just in terms of mental health, and also dangerous, extremely dangerous. So many farmers have lost like a finger, or, and Jonas himself, and his brother. Yeah, just sort of thought, right, I need to mention that because that is just so typical. There's all, and Patrick, their dad, when you meet him, he's had a fall and stuff, so that's all kind of very realistic. And even, the farmer who lives in southern Indiana, I didn't include this in the book at all because it felt, I don't really like pulling too much from real life generally. Obviously I do sometimes, and I'm inspired by real things, but he was talking about a funeral of, one of the farmers. A tractor had landed on top of him, and he talked about how, all of the farmers in the whole area came and like parked their tractors on the side of the road and lifted the trays up as the hearse was going by. And I was just imagining that as a really, really moving scene. And obviously, I didn't want to take something like that from someone's, especially when he was helping me with a book, but I could imagine that scenario. I did consider, writing something like that in there, but I didn't.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was a nice element because it did feel so realistic, and it also it added that extra layer to Jonas. He's not the love interest, he's not the one we're focusing on, but it was, really nice to see. It enriched his character, and through him, Anders as well. I want to talk a little bit about Anders' job, because from what I understand, you have a connection. So Anders works for the IndyCar team in Indianapolis. Tell us a little bit about your connection to that, because it sounds very fascinating to me. And how why you made that his job, and sort of your growing up in Indiana, or at least living there for a little bit.
Yeah, so my dad's a retired racing driver. He raced in the Indy 500 and, did lots of sort of IndyCar driving when I was younger. He went on to do, sports car racing in Le Mans, and he also did Formula One. He came third in the Indy 500 in 1981, if anyone wants to look him up. He was like Rookie of the Year in, I think, 76, and so he was, involved. And so when I was very young, that was why we were in Indianapolis. And then we moved to Phoenix because he was doing racing out that way. So again, I was able to write from experience with that. Ren spends the first 5 years of her life. And so I'm writing about my memories, because I spent my sort of first 6 or 7 years living in Indianapolis and then Phoenix. And then in my 20s, he ran an Indy Lights team out of Indianapolis with Stephanie Johansson, and Scott Dixon was like, if IndyCar fans are watching, they'll know that Scott is like one of the most successful, or the most successful IndyCar driver of all time. Dad was the one who brought Scott over from New Zealand, effectively. He was sort of involved in his early sort of getting into IndyCar. And so, so his name's Vern Schupan, if anyone is interested in checking him out. But basically in my 20s, that was when we went back. And I wrote about Formula One in my third book, Chasing Daisy. And it's about a girl who goes to work in hospitality for a Formula One driver. And the racing driver that she works for is called Luis Castro. He's a Brazilian driver. And anyone who's read this book will know that I give a little nod to someone called Luis Castro, who's now won, I think, the Indy 5, I think he's a 3-time world champion or something like that. So Indy drivers will be reading that Indy enthusiasts might be reading it and thinking, who on earth is Luis Castro? I've never heard of him, but he's made up. He's from my third book. I just like to write about real things, and it makes sense now. When I decided to set it in Indianapolis in Indiana, I thought it'd be really nice to have Anders working as somehow in the IndyCar thing, and race engineering just worked quite well.
Did your dad read this and weigh in?
I just asked him like some stuff, but I also spoke to someone who works in publicity for one of the great teams, one of the sort of main teams in Indy. Felix is the driver. I can't pronounce his surname, so I'm not going to try. But he gave me loads of, he was able to sort of talk about like back-to-back race weekends, and just the stuff and how the race engineers often work all through the night to get the car ready for the next day. And so he was able to just shed a bit of light, on what Anders' role would be. And I just thought it just sounded like, I liked the idea of him doing something other than farming, but I also liked the idea that he felt, duty upon himself, that if anything did happen to Anders, then he would have to step up into that farming role, because this farm had been passed down through so many generations since their original Swedish settlers had had moved there. So I like the idea of writing that duty and honor, and obviously that plays into things that happen later in the book too.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, he definitely does. Those are his core traits, that's for sure. I have to mention though, do you know when you Google your name, it says Paige Toon race car driver?
Honestly, a reader just pointed that out to me quite recently, and my husband and I just cracked up laughing. Like the fact that it says Paige Toon, race car driver. I think my husband actually contacted Google this week just. No,
I was like, wait, did I miss something? I was like going down the research rabbit hole to figure out, well, maybe her first career was as a race car driver.
Nope.
I was going to have a whole different line of questioning for you there. Yeah, very funny. So I want to talk about the family connection. Ren, when she, arrives in the United States, it feels like she's an outsider. She's not connected to that family at all. She's very close with her mother in England, but not, her father's stepmother or stepsister. But that transformation, throughout the book is just so wonderful to see her perspective grow. So what made you include that relationship, or those relationships, I should say, in the book, and how do you think they played a role in her overall character growth?
So initially, I came up with the title for the book well before I decided what I was going to write. The Paloma Faith song, Only Love Can Hurt Like This, is on my writing playlist. I'll listen to it sometimes when I'm out walking. And I just remember thinking this would make a fantastic title for a book, and especially one of my books, because I do write emotional love stories, rather than rom-coms. They're, a little bit, they're not supposed to be particularly funny. There'll be fun moments in them, but I'm not a comic writer. I wanted to make sure that title played into every aspect of the book. It's not just about Ren seeing her fiance at the beginning of falling in love with someone else. It's not just about Ren and Anders and their impossible situation. And so once I had that idea, then I knew that there needed to be some other complication, and also why she would be going to America. I wanted to start the book in England. And so once I started thinking about, and then I thought about Phoenix, and just the idea of, that maybe she spent 5 years there, and then the idea for her father came into play. And then, of course, it's just a natural growth of the character when you're, planning out, your character's growth. I think about them for a long time before I start writing. I tend to write very quickly, but I'm thinking about it for a good year before I'll come to actually start writing words. And so just imagining that scenario, her dad lives in another country and she's grown up in the UK. I was just imagining how difficult that would be to really get to know each other if they only see each other for a couple of weeks a year. They don't have a bad relationship, but they don't have a good relationship either. And I was imagining what it would be like for Cheryl, her stepmother, to be the other woman, and how that dynamic might change things. I didn't want to make her like an evil stepmother, but she's complicated, and that really comes through. And Ren has certain perceptions of what Cheryl, thinks about her that might not necessarily be right. And then Bailey, like she basically makes this comment, my dad chose Cheryl and Bailey got to grow up with my dad as her own. And so, she can't help but feel like Bailey has my dad, my dad should be with me, and my dad's with Bailey, and he knows her well, and I loved writing that dynamic. Like, as I started to get stuck into, the real grit of the story, and, sometimes you just can't help but have perceptions of different people. And, if someone might seem like they're a bit annoyed with you, then you think they're annoyed with you, but actually they might be annoyed because something completely nothing to do with you has just put them in a bad mood. And so Ren is kind of having those insecurities. She's thinking that her family, she doesn't really belong there, but actually she is wanted. So that was just a lovely development. And the thing is, when you come, I didn't necessarily know all of that before I started writing, but as I'm writing, I'm just kind of getting into the depth of the characters and getting to know Bailey. And I loved the character of Bailey. She and Jonas have a really lovely friendship, and the four of them kind of just, get along quite well. It was nice to be able to write about friendships and siblings as well as a love story.
Yeah. No, I loved all of that. There's a moment where her and Bailey are talking, and Ren is bringing up all of the ways in which she's sort of an outsider in the family. And she brings up, at dinner, I'm sort of set apart. And in that scene, she's really seeing, Bailey is nicely, setting her straight,
Mm.
she's seeing a lot of the things that I assumed they were thinking about me or felt about me are just me projecting. So
Yeah.
I think they think that I'm the odd man out, and really that's how I feel. So it was just so nicely done, and I agree. Bailey was such a wonderful character, especially if you have a sister. That relationship there was so great.
Thank
So
you.
I love that. I loved the even slower, I guess, arc of the relationship between her and her stepmom,
Yeah.
which I think is a little bit tougher,
Yeah.
considering the circumstances, but it was so well done. So
Oh.
I
I have to
love
say that moment with Cheryl, that was the first moment in the book that actually brought tears to my eyes.
Mhm.
It's like the first sort of rush of emotion was, this sort of step forward with her stepmother.
Mhm.
And I wasn't expecting that when I started writing. I was sort of expecting to kind of reach a point in the story where I would be uncontrollably sobbing, which I was, but not to feel the emotion to do with the family. And there were other points where that did sort of really make me,
Mhm.
make my heart kind of catch, and
Yeah, do you feel like you're an emotional writer? Where sort of like
oh
you're
my
getting
God.
into the head of the of the
Oh, honestly, for me, writing sort of feels almost like method acting. Like I am
Mhm.
so deeply entrenched in my characters' lives that I feel everything that they're feeling. I will be bawling my eyes out, just properly sort of sobbing and crying as I'm writing if it's an emotional scene. And
Mhm.
I'm always very tearful at the end of a book because I think just that release of emotion, even if it's a happy ever after, I always sort of feel, and I live with them for
Mhm.
so long, and I carry them with me for so long afterwards. It's actually I have to have a period of mourning almost to let them go so I can then move on to the next characters.
Mhm.
It's a very strange profession, but I love it. Like I love feeling it all. My tagline is feel it all. And that's the sort of book you can expect, to really be
Mhm.
inside the character's head and experiencing what she's experiencing at the same time that she's experiencing it. And hopefully getting goosebumps and, tears in your eyes and, laughing at the correct points as well.
Yes.
Hopefully. I certainly do. I mean, I just found ever since my first book, when I just wrote the book that I loved,
Mhm.
and then it was later sort of reading the reviews for it and people saying, I fell in love with Nathan. And I realized that they can, if so long as I'm connecting to the story, then my readers will
Yeah.
connect to the story. And I've just found
Yeah.
that ever since with every other book that I've written, like so long as I'm enjoying it and feeling it, which I always do, like not necessarily all the time, but certainly, and when I'm really into the meat of the story,
Mhm.
I'm just feeling every single thing. I'm, from about 40,000 to 100,000 words, I'm there, living through that with the characters. So hopefully that
Yeah.
comes across.
Well, which is probably why it can make you cry, is because you're sort of that character for the moment. Those
Yeah.
thoughts are channeling through you. I'm
Oh
with you.
God.
I feel like if you can have that cathartic, if you're reading and you can have that moment where you're crying or sobbing because of the
Mm.
character, it's like such a nice release afterwards.
Yeah.
If someone were going to pick up another one of your books, what is, a Paige Toon book? But you kind of answered that. Um,
I
you
mean,
know,
I would say that if you like this, then I'd be more inclined to go for my later books, like Someone I
mhm,
Used to Know and 5 Years from Now. 5 Years from Now is coming out in paperback. Putnam, my Penguin, my new publisher, have actually bought 4 of my backlist titles, and they'll be releasing them in paperback and making sure they're on, on the shelves. So 5 Years from Now is coming out in the fall. So yeah, I hope people look out for that. But at the moment, they're all available, but via Kindle and
yeah.
audiobook, and I self-publish the rest of my backlist, so they're all available. If anyone wants to check me out, they can always look at pagetoon.com if they want the reading order of publication or anything like that. But they're
Yes. Mhm.
generally standalone books, so yeah. But I would start, like I say, with my later books. I think they're more emotionally layered, and I've just grown as a writer over the years.
Yeah, I was going to ask
Yeah.
you that. Sort of, you've had a very long writing career so far. I think is it 15 or 16 novels that
Yeah,
you've
yeah,
written?
16
That's
plus, and 3 young adult books and a
yeah,
collection of short stories. So, yeah.
that's a lot. That's a long career. Um, so how do you think like your writing process or the books themselves have changed over that time? Because like you said, over that time you have to imagine that you're growing, you're learning, you're seeing what works, what doesn't, and just your skill set is improving. So how has the whole process changed for you?
It's weird, with my very first book, I was working as a reviews editor at Heat magazine, which is a really big magazine. Well, at the time, it was like selling 600,000 copies a week, and in the UK, it was like one of the biggest magazines available. And I got a book deal. I'd always wanted to write ever since I was little. Like, what I wanted more than anything else in the world was to become an author. And then basically a publicist said to me, you should write a book, you'd get a book deal, like working at Heat magazine. And I wrote this book. I got a 2-book deal before I'd even written it. I had a full-time job and I wrote it in 2.5 months. I had not written more than 3 pages up until that point. And because I was too scared to, I was generally but I couldn't kind of unlock my brain either just to make it happen. And so I wrote it in 3.5 months, and then I fell pregnant. And then I thought, well, I write books in 3 months. I can write my second one before my baby comes. I couldn't. I really struggled. And basically, when I wrote 50,000 words, and then my baby came, and then I had about 6 weeks where I was just, getting used to being a new mum. And then I ended up shredding those first 50,000 and writing 100,000 words, and only being 2 weeks late for delivery, delivering the book in middle of January. And then after that, I was like, right, this time I'm going to spend a whole year writing this book. And again, it came down to the last 3 months. So I just eventually, after quite a few books, I just thought, you know what? September. That's when I'm going to start writing a book, and I will research as much as I can up until that point. So I think that's the difference for me now, is that I just have the confidence to know that I can write a book, that it is always slow to begin with, but then I will write so much of it in the last few weeks, that it will just come and I will be feeling it once I reach a certain point. And I think in terms of like my earlier books, all of my books have always been, they've always had emotional different layers, and some of them are, like even my very early ones, quite dark, but they are also a little bit like the heroine's a bit bubblier, a bit chirpier. Like I think Ren is quite grown up, she's sort of, she's not like a hysterical kind of, obsessed with, the guy kind of, she's a bit more sort of grown up. And I think my characters, as I've got older, even though they're around the same age as I've always written, I think they are a little bit more mature. Like they don't get quite as jealous or quite as, obsessed with the guys,
Yeah. And I think just there's sort of that trend too in romance, because years ago, if you look at romance fiction or any kind of romances, even if it's not rom-com or a romance, I feel like the heroines were much more likely to be just focused on the guy, or they're talking whatever else is going on in their life, it's sort of revolving around him. Whereas now I feel like modern romances sort of do have those deeper layers and stuff too. So it kind of tracks with the books that we're seeing too, which is nice, because you do get those family elements for both her and him, and the jobs, they each have jobs that they're concerned about. So it adds nice layers to the books, that's for sure. It sounds like you are a procrastinator writer. Like the deadline is coming up. Now I can write.
Oh, do you know, like I honestly, like other authors sort of, I think, must just think that I only work 3 months of the year. I work so much the rest of the time, like just in terms of all of the research that I do. And I like to go to the places that I'm writing about and, do sort of proper imagine being there and writing about what my heroine would see in those situations. And then, of course, you have the different rounds of editing that you have to go through, and then all the publicity, that takes up a lot of energy and, headspace. And I'm so active on social media these days, and I have a newsletter, with, loads and loads of subscribers and stuff. So that I'm doing stuff all the time. But when it comes to writing, like I do just sort of allow myself to do those 3 months. And for the first month, or certainly for the second month, I'm usually in full panic mode, just like, it's not coming, I'm not really feeling it, and I just have to trust now that it will come and I will feel it. I just need to hit that 40,000 mark. And then after that, my characters just take on a complete life of their own, and then I can go back and make the rest of it better.
Nope, that makes sense. So I'm hoping that you can share with us some books that you love before we get into any sort of spoilery territory. Either all-time favorite books or books you think we should be reading because we loved Only Love Can Hurt Like This. What are some things that we should add to our TBR list?
I mean, to be honest, you've probably read them all. Like I love Colleen Hoover. Colleen Hoover, I was asked to quote on her first book, Slammed, here in the UK. And I remember reading that and just thinking, that we had a similar style. Both of the heroines are, is always first person present tense, so you're really inside the character's head and experiencing the same things. Her books were a little bit darker back then. Mine have maybe become a little bit more darker as I've sort of gone on. But, she's someone that I love all of her books. I think I really, really connect with her writing style. And I like reading the sort of books that I would write, like I like sort of, that's what I most connect with. So I like sort of, I do love Beth O'Leary, The Flat Share. I don't know if you've read that.
I loved that book. I love
Yeah, it's awesome. And I really like Emily Henry. Like, I mean, she writes, her books are a bit more, a bit sort of sexier and a bit funnier, than my books, but, you're still right there with the characters, sort of living with, what they're going through at the same time. A British author called Vari McFarlane, I think, is a really great author. She writes them as Mhairi, Mari. It sort of looks like Mari, but her name's Vari. Yeah. So yeah, those sort of, I would definitely recommend all of those.
Okay. Well, for anyone who hasn't read the book, fast forward until the end, because we're going to talk about Anders' secret. And this is definitely something you don't want spoiled. So fair warning, proceed with caution. So let's talk about this. You said that you came up with a situation because you encountered it a couple of times in real life. Did you have to do a lot? I'm assuming you didn't talk to those people about it. So did you have to do any sort of research to just figure out the logistics of how things would work? I know I'm sort of talking around the issue here, but what sort of research and preparation did you do to write that?
So are we going to avoid sort of spoiling it 100% just in case?
If you have to, yes.
Yeah. If I can, like, I'll try and just talk around the issue. So I heard of this accident happening when we lived in Indianapolis. It had happened to two other people at a go-karting track where their long hair had got caught in the wheels and they basically had suffocated. So I'd heard of this situation happening. It had happened like twice to the go-kart track that we didn't go to, and that one had been closed down. I've heard of it since with local go-karting tracks. I think it's actually horribly common where people will get a scarf or long hair caught in the wheel axle as it goes around and be strangled. So it's traumatic in itself. And it was, a few years ago, one of my closest friends was absolutely distraught, and her old friend from university, it had happened to her.
Wow.
And she was still alive, but her family, and the thought of writing about, her husband and her children, like Anders has a wife who we lost 4.5 years ago. He doesn't have children. That scenario is it's just too heartbreaking to bear. But I basically looked at the situation for people who were in the similar situations where an accident had put them in this situation, and watched a lot of videos, which just made me cry so much, where the parents might still be looking after their children. And it's just heartbreaking because they're no longer with you, but they're with you. The idea that someone can be, have their eyes open and be still eating and drinking, but not being with you is just the most, I just couldn't imagine a worse hell, to see my mum, for example, and she's alive, but she's not with me it just absolutely, I mean, I can almost cry thinking about it now, like it's just so that, it's the most impossible situation. I just imagined a scenario where that someone might be in a situation like that, knowing that they're never going to get their loved one back. But at what point could you walk away if they're still there, and they're still breathing and they're still looking, and see, like, not necessarily seeing, but still, it would be very, very difficult. And there were other, stories online about some people who had moved on and, wanted to do the humane thing, what they felt was humane. And the families on the other side, opposing it in court and going through all the court cases because they don't want their child, to be taken away. And it just, like, the whole scenario was just so riddled with so many complications. And the weirdest thing is that after my mum read this book, And I remember now, but I'd forgotten, this same thing happened to some relatives of mine, some distant
Oh my
relatives of
goodness.
mine. I know, it's just like insane. Back in Australia, which is where I grew up as well, you know, I spent a lot of time growing, like
Yes.
you might better hear that I have
I
a
love
slight
it.
Australian accent. It's because I grew up between Australia, England, and America, because we were basically following my dad's racing car
Mhm.
career around the world. So yeah, so distant relatives in Australia. It's just it's
Wow.
insane, you know.
Yeah, I mean, you've called it an impossible situation, and it is because, you really feel for Anders there. There is no good choice, and her parents, you know, kind of are I don't want to say villain, but you kind of oppose them, especially her mother. But you can so easily put yourself into their heads
That
and say,
yeah.
what would I do in that situation?
And
Why?
honestly, I think the thing that made me cry more than anything else when I was writing this was putting myself in
Mhm.
her mother's like position. And so even though she's kind of a difficult character, you know, she's difficult with Ren, you know, she's sort of is a really, like you say, you know, she's kind of cast a bit as a villain, but actually I have more empathy for her than anybody else. You know, like I can like when I was writing, that was the moment when I fully broke down. It was when you were really sort of seeing it, and I'm just like imagining what that would be like. You know,
Yeah.
I was inconsolable for like, you know,
That was
just
a tough chapter, and I wanted to ask you too, what made you switch to Anders' point of view at the end? Because I mean, it's hard to see all of that through Ren's eyes, but to
mhm,
really get that chapter and be in his head, and just this choice that he has to make, and the choice the guilt
mhm.
and all of those layers of emotions. What made you switch so that we could see that element through his eyes?
So it wasn't planned. I basically got to that point in the story, and I hadn't fully felt the amount of emotion that I felt the book deserved.
Mhm.
And I just suddenly thought about being in Anders' head and what he would be feeling. And that was when I just started, you know, I started to cry, and I just thought I have to write from his perspective. So that was interesting, you know, because I don't normally write. I have done it before, but very, very rarely. I think it might only be with The Longest Holiday, which, you know, you jump into the perspective of the male character there, you
Mhm.
know, but on the whole, you know, I'm always firmly rooted inside the heroine's head and
Mhm.
wanting to experience it from her perspective. But yeah, so that was, I found that quite powerful. Like once I was inside his head and really kind of understanding where his head was at throughout all of that, and how that struggle that must have been for him, you know, to let
Mhm.
her go, you know, that was the most emotional chapter for me by far.
Oh, yeah. That was like a multiple Kleenex chapter.
Oh.
One where you're just like, I mean, there's no good answer. There's no you empathize with everyone, and it's just so painful, but really well done because,
Yeah.
there's that moment where you can kind of see him just transform,
Mhm.
and get rid of all that guilt. But just, such a tough situation. I can't even imagine. And I
Mm.
fully understand why you cried while writing this book.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
Um, well, I think I want to give enough time for the reader questions. So we can have Lauren hop back on, and we will go over some questions that we have from our readers. I think at this point it is safe for anyone to listen in again if they had wanted to avoid spoilers. So we'll put a little note on the video for that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, hello. It's been fascinating just to listen to how this story came to be. We have a lot of questions about locations, so I'm going to try to
Great.
combine them. One of the first ones is why the intro of an English character? I mean, we know that you are English, but why have the English character and then set it in America?
So the part of that was the reason for the idea of the storyline, you know, Only Love Can Hurt Like This. I wanted it to feed into other aspects, so her family as well. And so when I developed the idea that she grew up separate to her dad and had to be put in this situation where, you know, she would get to know him, that worked from that perspective. But also because I am, you know, I only spent like a little bit of time in America when I was young and when I was in my 20s. So it would be harder for me to put myself to write from the perspective of an American really authentically and to really feel connected to the character. So I do that. I tend to sort of choose characters that I can really imagine, going through their journey with them. So it made more sense. And I love Bury St. Edmunds, which is where the book opens. They have like this incredible, like these cathedral ruins, which are hundreds and hundreds of years old. And it's like a fairy tale. You walk around this village and there are tiny, tiny little pubs, like the smallest pub in England. And, and they have just like, it's beautiful sort of settings. So I really wanted to set a book there. And in fact, I'm probably going to have to try and write a future book there because I didn't end up setting much there at all. In the end, we moved the story very quickly onto America. But yeah, so I wanted to write from the perspective of a British girl because that's what I could most identify with, know. But there were other reasons.
This was another location question of how did you decide to use these locations specifically? And are you familiar with Arizona and Indiana?
Yes. So my earliest memory is being in Indianapolis in an apartment block, and the apartment block on the other side of this lake was burning down. Like I just had this strange, really strange memory. And I just still remember, like I say, the fireflies and things. And in my 20s, when he was my boyfriend at the time, but he's my husband now, but we went and spent some time there when my mum and dad were living there. And, we met some other friends there who just showed us so much of Indianapolis and Bloomington, and we did like so many fun things together and went to some fantastic like restaurants, and we went duckpin bowling at this place called Fountain Square, which is just so cool. And Indianapolis, like the Rathskeller, was one of my favorite restaurants when we were there. So I love to write about places I've either lived in or been to. Every family holiday that we go on pretty much is, will be centered around where I might like to set my next book, so it's just something that I really like to do. I connect so much to the characters if I'm writing about personal experience. So it just worked. And when I was thinking about, where to set this book, when I had the farm setting and just could suddenly, initially I was imagining maybe somewhere in England, somewhere like Devon. And then when I suddenly thought, actually, I haven't written about Indiana or Indianapolis, and imagine that setting with the, cornfields and fireflies, the idea just ran away with me.
I love that.
Okay. Our next question is, we made a little video that you sent us of your little writing space, which I thought was so great.
Oh my goodness, I'm very jealous of that.
Anyone who didn't see that, can you talk about the special place that you write?
Yes. So when I first started writing, I, wrote during baby nap times. Like, as I said earlier, I fell pregnant straight after I'd finished my first book, didn't go back to work at the magazine, and I literally would write when my baby was sleeping next to me. That was the only time I'd write. And then after a few years, when my children had a second baby and they started going to nursery, then I would write from a local coffee shop. And then eventually decided to sort of write from home. But there are so many distractions at home. And we have an old camper van that broke down a few too many times. And so we parked it at the end of the garden with a view over the fields. And that is now my writing studio. And basically I had written another book called The Last Piece of My Heart, which is about a person who ghostwrites another book. And I set that on the campsite. It's very, the setting is the camper van. And so I was very attached to the space, like really attached to the camper van, the idea of just fixing it up and selling it off, when actually a writing shed would have cost more than it was worth. And so just being able to park that down the end of the garden and, lock it up, and it's got fairy lights in there, and it's just my space, and it's lovely and clean, and it's got a lovely view. And, when I'm down there, I don't even connect to the internet, like I'm just down there and I'm just
ask you if you had Wi-Fi out there.
Yeah, no, I don't. So it's only on my phone. So sometimes, it can be a bit annoying if I'm trying to do some research, I tend to do my research when I get back inside and just focus on writing, but I'll listen to music down there and, really get lost in the characters and what's happening in their heads.
I was just going to ask because of you mentioned so much about research, is like when I'm writing too, my one excuse for I need the internet. What if I need to look something up? So someone actually asked about the research that you did into, I think you talked about this a bit when you talked about popcorn farming, which I did not. When I was reading the book, I was like, popcorn is different than corn as far as what you grow. So yeah, can you talk about a little bit more about what you learned in your research in regards to farming?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I just learn so much with every book I write. You know, it's something that's really nice actually, because sometimes I'll take on a subject that I want to learn more about. Other times it's really overwhelming because I'm not particularly interested in the subject, but it fits the storyline. So yeah, in terms of farming, obviously I learned that popcorn's about 6 feet tall and normal corn's about 10 feet tall, and you know, they're sort of still harvested around the same time. And it was stuff like, you know, working out when the pumpkin flowers would flower and stuff like that, and then when the balloon, you know, when they sort of start ballooning and turning orange, and just making sure that those little details are all correct as you go on, and peach farming and apple farming and, you know, stuff like that. I mean, I didn't learn how to make a Bellini because I already knew. But funnily enough, the cocktail that Ren makes, she makes this rhubarb syrup and does it with vanilla vodka and sort of makes this nice cocktail. That was my personal recipe. So, if you go on my Instagram page, Paige Toon author, on my Instagram, I've done a reel to sort of show you how you can make the cocktail. So if you fancy a summer drink and have rhubarb growing in your garden.
I was going to say that sounds so summery.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Like it was a lockdown creation because my next door neighbor has the most enormous rhubarb like plant, and she was trying to get rid of it. And so I looked up how I could, you know, make some syrup and add it. And I just the year before bought a candy floss machine, which that's the other thing about growing up between different countries, is I know all of the different names for cotton candy, cotton candy, candy floss, fairy floss if you're in Australia. You know, I sort of grew up knowing the different things for popsicle or ice block or ice lolly. You know? There are all these different things.
I didn't know those.
Yeah, they mattered to me as a child. The best thing, though, I just digress slightly, is when I went to Paris recently, my friend bought my kids a lollipop and she said it was Bappa Papa flavor. I'm like, what's Bappa Papa? And it's Papa's beard. That is the French translation for cotton candy.
No way.
Papa's beard.
Oh,
I loved it.
The least appetizing of all of the terms.
Yeah. So basically, I was even making little puffs of cotton candy to stick on the cocktail. Yeah. So, you know, it's a really nice drink.
Oh, that sounds good.
Yeah, that sounds good. So we have a question about who is your author influence, and then a similar question of is Jane Eyre an influence on you?
Oh, Jane Eyre, not so much. Like I would say my like the characters in Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility is probably the most. I just remember, you know, Sense and Sensibility with Marianne, the way she falls head over heels in love with Willoughby, and then ends up with Colonel Brandon. I was just so upset at the time. You know, I wanted her to have the rock star romance. You know, like that's my second book is called Johnny Be Good, and it's about, you know, she's a PA and she goes to work for a rock star, and you know, he's a real bad boy and he has a really nice other friend. And actually, I wanted her to end up with the friend and for the readers to be cross, and they were so cross. They were so cross, you know. But so I may be more inspired by Jane Austen, but to be honest, like the sort of books that I read these days, you know, are always love stories, and they're always, you know, things like Colleen Hoover. And, you know, I just love being fully connected to the story. And, you know, I might read something in Emily Henry, for example, and think, oh, she's written that so beautifully, like that's such a nice turn of phrase. And then it will just make me try a bit harder to, you know, kind of write a nice turn of phrase and, you know, kind of connect and stuff. So yeah, so I'm influenced by the sort of writers that, you know, I kind of would place myself somewhere alongside them, hopefully.
Nice. Yeah. Similar to influences, what inspires you?
Everything. For anyone who's interested, Domestica is this huge company that make courses, and they asked me to do a writing course about a year ago. So I went out to Paris and filmed it, and in this course, I talk about all of my influences, and I get so inspired by other books, by films, by music. You know, I wrote a book, One Perfect Summer, which is inspired by by Adele's Someone Like You, you know, that song. And I just remember, you know, listening to that and thinking, what would it be like to be, you know, like a famous person? And then what would it be like to be the person that she's talking about? You know, that this massive famous person has never been able to forget you. And, you know, but you had such an impact on them when you were younger. And then, for that person to have gone on and had another. So I basically I often twist it, I'll come up with an idea and then I'll think about it from somebody else's perspective, or, watch a film and I'll be like, oh, but what about that character? Wonder what happened to them, or what if this had happened instead, and it will take me off in a different direction. And suddenly, all these other ideas kind of slot into place and I've got a fully formed story, so yeah, I'm really inspired by other creative, outlets basically, and things will just pop into my head and I'll be off on one.
I love
and then
that.
letting him mull for a bit and
what was that, sorry?
And letting him mull for
yeah
at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but funnily, like I had the next book that I'm about to start writing, sometimes it just happens so quickly. I might have an idea that I'm like mulling over for a few months, and then it's often the next idea that sort of slots in, and then sometimes they weave themselves together and they become the same book, but there are different ideas that sort of all feed in. So, and then it's just amazing how quickly it happens. Like Seven Summers, my next book, I had a very vague idea, spoke to my editors about it. They're like, let's talk in 5 days, and we'll thrash it out and come up with this idea. My American editor is the editor of Where the Crawdads Sing, Tara Singh Carlson. Like she's it's fantastic. I have a really, really good UK editor, and the two of them together are just like amazing. So we got together, and weirdly in the over those 5 days I just had a completely fully formed idea, and they were just sitting there listening, and at the end they were both in tears and they were just like, I have nothing to say. So it's amazing when the right idea comes, it just comes, and it comes fully formed.
Well, I know one of our members asked this, and I don't know what you can say at this point, but is there anything you could tell us about that book that you're working on next?
Seven Summers? Yeah. So Seven Summers is a story of Liv, Finn, and Tom, and it basically starts with this summer where she's meeting and falling in love with Tom, who's this mysterious guy who's appeared in her beach town, and he's a sand artist. He's sort of drawing on the sand, but he's a helicopter search and rescue pilot, but for some reason he's not doing his job anymore. He has a secret, there's a reason why he's there, and it's another impossible situation. And then it's also told over the previous 6 summers where Liv was meeting and falling in love with Finn, who comes back year after year to the same place every summer. In that first summer, a real tragedy occurs, which basically bonds them together forever. And so you're getting this idea of what's happened in her past, and then coming back to the future, and sort of you're coming back to the present day. And so it's sort of woven in as basically 7 summers, but that at the end of the 7th summer she's going to have this impossible choice to make. So it's a love triangle. It's that one. I swear I cried even more with that one than I did with this. In fact, I ended up ridiculously going onto Instagram Live at 1 a.m. and doing this sobbing video where I'm just like telling my readers about how my family had all gone away because they leave me for my last weekend just so I can be completely immersed in the characters. My husband will take them up north to see their grandparents, and so in that weekend I was just writing until 1 a.m, finished this book, was complete, like such a wreck. I'd been crying for like 15 minutes and I just thought, I gotta tell someone, I'll tell my readers. And then immediately sort of like kind of went to bed afterwards, and then I woke up in the morning and said, oh my God, did I do a live last night? And had a big freak out, and went online thinking I might delete it, and there was so many comments already. I was just like, okay,
can't do it.
I love that. I think seeing an author's like extreme passion and emotion tied to a project makes me want to read. Like when they're going through emotional turmoil, you're like, I have to read it.
I want that. I want to feel that.
Yeah,
I need to feel
fiction.
Oh well, I hope I really. It's just seeing the reviews and things and the feedback from readers at the moment, and how they're connecting with the story and how it's moving them, and it's just that's the best feeling for me as an author. I mean, I would think I would write now no matter what if I didn't have any readers. Like, it's my absolute dream job. I feel very, very lucky. I never ever take it for granted. But just to know that there are so many readers who are connecting and feeling all those things that I felt, because being an author is a really solitary business. You are sitting there by yourself. until your book comes out, and then you're in this community of love for those characters, and you know, and they've taken on a life of their own. Like they feel so real to me, all of my characters, like all of them. Looking back over all the years, you know, I could still tell you what each and every one of them are doing, you know, like I know that their stories have kind of lived on in the background, you know. And to have that passion for my readers is just it means the world, you know, it really does.
Yeah.
That leads us into our next question of how did you first become interested in writing? I also want to just add, I love that your name is Paige, which is
I know. I had a lot of people saying to me when I first started writing, "Oh, if only you'd married a Turner instead of a Toon." You know?
Well, yeah. You did make a mistake there.
It was never a decision. I have written like stories, songs, and poems ever since I can remember, and I know that the very first job I ever wanted was to be an author. You know, that was the first thing. And then later, when I was a teenager, I was reading magazines, I thought, actually, no, what I'll do is I'll go and work for a magazine, and then when I have kids, then I'll become an author. And it was only when I was actually working for the magazine or trying to get into working for the magazine that I realized how difficult that was. But it did happen, and then I did end up going on to become an author. So that's why there were many years when I thought this is going to be my biggest regret. I'm never going to write the book that I want to write. It's never going to happen. I will live with that regret for the rest of my life. And so I had a few years of fully doubting myself that I would ever be able to do it. But the fact that it did happen like that, that's why I cannot stop pinching myself. Like I genuinely, it's my life's made. I feel very, very lucky.
I love that. Our last question is about the different type, going back to the book, the different types of jobs that we see. We've got a party planner, farming, architecture, auto engineering. What initiated these professions? Because they worked very well in the story.
Oh, thank you. Well, the farming came from the original idea. My husband's an architect, and I'd never written about an architect. I'd never written about architecture. And it just fit with Ren. You know, I liked the idea that and it fit with Anders. When I decided to set the book in Indianapolis, I thought somehow I'd like him to be involved in motor racing, and that was nice because it has a personal connection for me. Event planning for Bailey, that just developed as I was going along. I was trying to think about what it is that she could do, and then it just worked with the storyline because she's, you know, comes up with this idea of doing some events on the farm. But the whole, you know, the architecture thing for Ren, it was just really nice. Like I've been with my husband for a lot of years. We've been married for 20 years now. And, you know, like we're both very heavily involved in each other's careers. Oh, I'm sorry, that's the phone going. Apologies for that. We're both really involved in each other's careers. So it was nice to be able to write about something that I knew about, but also to be able to ask him, you know, for help with my research. And it was just funny, things like how they work on this. They find this old Airstream, like that would be a dream of mine, you know, to have an Airstream and do the renovations. And I remember saying to my husband, what if they were to open it up, you know, at the back? And he's like, you'd have to hinge it at the panel gap. And basically that conversation she has with Ren is the conversation I had with my husband, you know. So that's quite cool.
I was going to say, that reminded me of you saying you work out of the caravan, and you know, she's renovating this Airstream. Very wish fulfillment there, I guess.
Yeah, completely. Like I so want an Airstream now, you know. But yeah, I'll make do with the camper van.
I think we had one more question that came in, and it was, and I don't even know if this is something that you decided or your publisher decided, but we had people who were very into the discussion questions and the Q&A with you at the back of the book. So is that something that you requested? Is that something that your publisher suggested doing?
Yes, it was my publisher. So I have this amazing new American publisher, Putnam Penguin, and that was their idea. So they you know, came up with the questions and we wrote them in the back. It was really nice. It's like a lovely addition that the UK edition doesn't have that. So it's really nice that that's sort of exclusive to the American edition, and you can get a little bit more insight into what's going on. Can I just say thank you? Like, thank you to all the readers who did send them in, and thank you so much for having me on. Like, it's been really nice talking to you. And
And tell us again, we have the little ticker at the bottom, but tell us again where people can reach you if they want to learn more about your books or just follow along.
Sure. Well, I am really active on social media and I love hearing from my readers. If I don't reply to you, then that's incredibly rare. Like I think I reply to just about everyone who ever reaches out to me. So it's really nice to hear from people. So at Paige Toon Author, and I'm on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Probably most active on Instagram at the moment. Bookstagram seems to be like where I'm getting most of the readers coming in. But it's, really lovely to connect with people. And if you're needing a bit more information, or if you're interested in the writing course, then pagetoon.com. Everywhere has like links to each other, so I'm pretty easy to find.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Paige. It was awesome talking about this book and learning some of the background and everything that went into it. So really, really wonderful. Thank you so much. And for everyone who is watching, again, the book is Only Love Can Hurt Like This by Paige Toon. It is available now. Yes, it is such a good read. I really, really recommend it. So if you haven't already, definitely recommend you go pick up the book and bring it to the beach. It's a good beach.
I should show you, just in case anyone watches from the UK, then that's what it looks like over here. They're both beautiful. Like I couldn't choose which one I love more. So thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
And happy reading, everyone.